These 6 true sleepover horror stories are inspired by real events. Here's just a sample of the nightmares we have for you tonight. First, a birthday sleepover is interrupted by the sounds of a man who has broken into the house, not to steal or to harm, but to spend the night building something impossible in the dark. Next, a group of friends messing with a Ouija board get a message so specific they laugh it off, until a chilling coincidence proves the game was real all along. And finally, 2 young girls are watched by a stranger from a basement window. But it's what the police find on him later that reveals the true, unthinkable horror of what he had planned. Make sure you listen to the very end, because you're going to want to hear what they found in his backpack that proved just how lucky those girls really were. Maya's house was a decent place for a sleepover. It was a simple 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where the biggest event of the week was garbage day. For her 15th birthday, she had 4 friends over. At 15, they were old enough for a bit more freedom. Maya's dad worked the midnight shift at a factory across town, so he trusted her to be responsible when he wasn't there. They hauled sleeping bags and pillows upstairs to her room, creating a messy fortress around the TV. The plan was simple: stay up all night powered by a mountain of junk food and talk until the sun came up. By 9 o'clock, the front door was locked, a movie was playing, and the 5 girls were sealed in their own little world, convinced of its safety. An hour later, the first movie ended. During the scramble to pick a new one, it was Chloe who first noticed something. Her friends all lovingly teased her, calling her OCD girl because she had a knack for noticing every little thing that was out of place. A crooked picture frame, a scuff on a shoe, anything. And true to her name, while everyone else was arguing over what to watch next, her eyes drifted to the window. The last bit of daylight was gone, leaving the backyards in deep shadow. "Hey!" she said, her voice cutting through the debate. She pointed. "Is that basement window supposed to be open?" The other girls crowded around. Sure enough, a small, dark rectangle on the ground floor was propped open by a few inches, a black gap in the foundation. Maya squinted at it. "My dad was probably down there earlier," she said with a dismissive shrug. "He forgets it sometimes." The answer was good enough for everyone. The debate returned to the movie selection, and the open window was forgotten. They settled on a comedy, and for the next hour and a half the room was filled with the sounds of a normal sleepover. They laughed at the dumb jokes on screen, argued about the best kind of chips, and talked about boys from school. The house felt solid around them, a familiar and protective shell. Nothing felt out of place. The world outside the bedroom door, outside the house itself, simply ceased to exist. It was just them. It was close to 11:30 when the movie ended, and a comfortable quiet settled over the room. It wasn't an awkward silence, just the easy quiet of old friends. And in that quiet, they heard it. It wasn't a loud noise, just a single sharp clack from the hallway. A moment later, the bright line of light shining from under their door vanished. They all stopped talking and looked at the door, then at each other. "Probably just a burned-out bulb," Maya said, her voice a little too loud in the silent room. She tried to sound sure of herself. They tried to go back to their conversation, but the easy feeling was gone. A tiny, cold seed of wrongness had been planted. At midnight, that seed began to sprout. Another sound came from downstairs, much louder this time. It was a heavy, solid clack, the unmistakable sound of a main circuit breaker being thrown with force. In the same instant, the bedroom lights flickered once and died, plunging them into a thick, disorienting darkness. At the same time, the signal bars on their phones vanished, The Wi-Fi was gone. They were completely cut off. In the black, Sarah started to cry, a small, choked sound. The other girls shushed her gently, telling her it was okay, but the words felt hollow and useless. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. An hour crawled by. Sarah whispered that she had to use the bathroom. No one wanted to open the door, but she was insistent. Maya and Eliza agreed to go with her, their phone screens providing a weak, trembling light that seemed to be swallowed by the darkness of the hallway. They crept to the bathroom and pushed the door open. Maya aimed her phone's light at the mirror. Scrawled across the glass in greasy, dark red lipstick was a message. "I see you." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "That's my lipstick," she whispered. Eliza was sure she had seen that tube on the bedroom dresser just before the lights went out. This was the moment the fear became real and sharp. This wasn't a power outage. This was a person. They stumbled back to the bedroom and threw the lock. It was a small metallic click against a vast and threatening silence. They were 5 girls huddled on a floor, listening. The silence from the rest of the house was the loudest sound they had ever heard. Around 2 in the morning, the silence was broken. Footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate, coming from the living room directly below them. The person wasn't hiding. They walked on the old hardwood floor with an unnerving confidence like they owned the place. The floorboards groaned under their weight with each step. The girls could trace the sound as it moved from the living room to the kitchen, paused, and then returned. It was the calm, patient walk of someone who had all the time in the world. The footsteps stopped, but the quiet that followed was worse. At 2:30 a.m., one last faint clack echoed up from the basement. The screens on their phones, their only lights, went black. The last circuit was dead. They were in absolute perfect darkness. For the next 2.5 hours, new sounds began. Not footsteps. A slow, dragging scrape of something heavy being pulled across the wood floor. A quiet, solid thud. A pause, then the scraping would start again from a different part of the room. It was methodical, rhythmic work. The sounds were impossible to place, leaving the girls to imagine what was being built, what was being arranged in the dark below. They sat frozen until the first hint of morning light turned the window from black to gray. The moment the light appeared, the sound stopped. They waited, listening to their own breathing, until the sun was fully up. Just before 5 a.m., they heard the familiar sound of a key in the front door. It was Maya's dad, home from his shift. A moment later, he yelled. It wasn't an angry sound. It was a strangled cry of disbelief. That was the signal. The girls unlocked the door and ran downstairs. They all stopped at the bottom step, staring. In the middle of the living room stood a tower. Every heavy piece of furniture, the couch, the armchairs, the coffee table, the bookshelf, was stacked into a 7-foot-tall, perfectly balanced pyramid. It was a silent, impossible monument to the night's events. The police arrived a short time later, 2 officers who looked tired and confused. They walked through the house, their boots loud on the hardwood floors. They confirmed the entry point, the open basement window. They noted the cut wire on the security camera, snipped at precisely 1:15 a.m. But they had no answers for the thing in the living room. The girls sat on the kitchen floor, wrapped in blankets, while Maya's dad tried to explain. "Nothing's gone," he kept saying, his voice ragged. "I checked. The TV, the wallets, the laptops upstairs. It's all here. He didn't take anything." One of the officers knelt down and looked at the girls. "Did you hear anything that sounded like a truck? Or more than one person?" The girls just shook their heads, unable to speak. They had only heard the one set of footsteps, the slow, heavy, methodical footsteps of a single person. One person who had done this. The question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone. Why? Why go to all that trouble? Why break into a house full of people, not to steal, not to hurt, but to build, to stack furniture into a bizarre, pointless monument? The sheer lack of motive was a special kind of terror. It was an act that made no sense, a message with no translation. It was a glimpse into a mind that didn't work like anyone else's. That was the real horror. As the first officer was finishing his report in the kitchen, the second one called out from the counter. "Hey, what about this?" Tucked behind the fruit bowl was a neatly folded piece of paper. It was the only thing in the entire house, other than the lipstick on the mirror, that the intruder had left behind. The officer picked it up with a gloved hand and unfolded it. The handwriting inside was clean and calm, and it said, "Don't worry, Maya. I didn't forget your gift." Maya never had another sleepover. The girls never forgot the feeling of being in that room, listening to a stranger work in the dark. But more than the fear, they were haunted by the question they knew would never be answered. Why? Some folks get spooked by things that go bump in the night. A noise in the dark, a shadow that moves wrong. But real horror, the kind that sticks to you, is quieter. It's the chilling realization that the world doesn't work the way you thought it did. It's the kind of thing that happened to a girl named Olivia. It was 2020 out in Oregon, a time when everything felt like it was holding its breath. The days just dragged on, long and empty. On one of those nights, Olivia was having a sleepover with her two friends, Madison and Jasmine. They were in that state of late-night boredom only a sleepover can bring, having burned through every scary movie they could find. The night was still young and quiet. That's when the bad ideas start. Olivia's mom had an old Ouija board packed away in the basement, a piece of cardboard and plastic nobody had thought about in years. They weren't just messing around. They had a target. A boy from their high school, Carter, had died a few months back. It was a horrible, tragic story. He and his older brother found their parents' gun. They were playing around and it went off. An accident, but Carter was gone. That's who they were going to call. They cleared a space on the floor of Olivia's bedroom, the faded carpet rough under their knees. Surrounded by sleeping bags and scattered junk food, they put their fingers on the little heart-shaped piece, the planchette. The plastic felt cheap and cool against their skin. Olivia took a breath. "We want to speak to Carter," she said to the still air of the room. For a long minute, nothing happened. The piece just sat there. Jasmine started to giggle. "Dude," she whispered, "how's he gonna know? We just said Carter. There's probably a million Carters. We didn't even say the high school." And then it moved. It wasn't a quick little push. It was a slow, heavy drag. The sound it made was awful. A low scraping noise, the felt pads on the bottom grinding across the cheap printed letters of the board. The girls went dead silent. The planchette slid deliberately, with a weight that didn't feel human until it rested on the word yes. They all looked at each other, eyes wide. "You're moving this shit, aren't you?" Madison hissed at Jasmine. "Nope," Jasmine shot back, her voice tight. "I thought it was you." Olivia knew it wasn't her. The giggly sleepover energy in the room had vanished, replaced by something sharp and electric. This wasn't a game anymore. Madison's voice was shaky, but she pushed. "Prove it's you!" she challenged the board. "Prove you're Carter!" The planchette started to move again, spelling out a single, brutal word. G-U-N-A. Collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Madison snatched her hand back like she'd been burned. "Nope," she said, scrambling to her feet. "I'm out. I'm done with this." She backed away from the circle of light, her face pale. Now it was just Olivia and Jasmine, their fingers still trembling on the piece. A morbid curiosity had taken hold of them, stronger than the fear. Jasmine leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. "When did you die?" The planchette moved again, slow and steady. It slid to the numbers. 2020. The current year. Correct. That was it for Jasmine. A choked sob escaped her throat. "Okay, we have to say goodbye," she said, her voice cracking. "Olivia, we have to get off." She tried to slide the planchette to goodbye, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was glued to the board. Then it started to move on its own, dragging her finger with it. She yelped and pulled her hand away, leaving Olivia completely alone, her one finger the only point of contact between her world and something else. "Goodbye," Olivia said firmly, trying to push the piece to the bottom of the board. But it was like trying to push a rock. The planchette resisted, then began to move with a will of its own, spelling out a new message, fast and frantic. It didn't feel like it was from Carter anymore. It felt like something else had taken the line. DONOTANSWERTHEDOORWHENSHECOMES. The message stopped. The pressure under Olivia's finger was gone. The planchette felt like a cheap piece of plastic again. She ripped her hand away and stumbled back from the board, which now looked like a venomous thing lying on her floor. They put the board away, and the rest of the sleepover was tense and quiet. As weeks went by, the memory started to fade, feeling more like a bad dream than something that had actually happened. About a month later, their friend Aliyah got her driver's license. She'd just gotten a used SUV and was ecstatic. The first thing she did was drive to Olivia's house, excited to take her friends out for a celebratory ride. She pulled into the driveway and knocked on the front door. Olivia was in her room, heard the knock, and just didn't feel like being bothered. She wasn't in the mood to hang out. She called out to her little sister, who was in the living room. "Hey, can you get that? Just tell whoever it is I'm sleeping." Her sister shrugged and went to the door. She opened it a crack and saw Aliyah standing there, smiling. "Sorry," her sister said. "Olivia's exhausted. She's asleep." Aliyah's face fell a little, but she nodded. "Oh, okay. No problem. Tell her I'll see her later." She gave a little wave, got back in her car, and drove off by herself. The phone call came later that night. It was Madison. Her voice was a wreck. "It's Aliyah," she sobbed. "There was an accident. A semi-truck. She's gone." The words didn't seem real. Olivia's legs gave out, and she slid down the wall to the floor. Madison kept talking, giving the horrible details. Aliyah had been on one of those winding back roads just outside of town. She'd been driving alone. Olivia hung up the phone, numb. She sat there in the dark, the terrible news echoing in her head. And then, another memory surfaced. A cold, sharp memory from a month before. The dusty box from the sleepover. The single shocking word. The final warning. "Do not answer the door when she comes, Aliyah." It was Aliyah at the door, and Olivia hadn't answered, not out of fear, but because she just didn't feel like it. That's when the real horror began. Not a ghost, not a board, but the chilling realization clicking into place. The game was real. The warning was real. And by a stupid, meaningless coincidence, she had obeyed it. Her life wasn't saved by a choice. It was spared by a forgotten message and a mundane desire to be left alone, leaving her to forever question if her survival was just dumb luck or something far, far worse. Sounds of breathing, ragged and fast, were the only things moving in the dark. It was the kind of breathing that hurt, that scraped the back of the throat with every gasp. A thin beam from a cheap flashlight cut through the blackness, shaking so much the shadows seemed to jump and twist on the walls. The light landed on a messy stack of photographs, all of them blurry, taken too close. The one on top showed a woman in a kitchen, caught mid-laugh, completely unaware. Another was a girl walking a dog in the backyard. The girl was Addison. Right now, her face was a pasty, sickly gray. She and her friend, Savannah, stood frozen, staring into a small, dark hole in the wall they'd just discovered. Their own shadows stretched into the opening ahead of them, long and thin like grasping fingers. The silence in the basement was a physical thing, a weight pressing down on their chests. It was a silence that felt wrong, like it was listening. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Who took these pictures? A few hours earlier, the house was just a house. It was new to them, sure, but it was supposed to be a home. It was an old place out in the Texas countryside, and it had a smell to it, a dry, dusty smell, like a library full of books that were turning to powder. It was big, too, with rooms that echoed because they hadn't had time to fill them up yet. For Addison, it felt less like a new beginning and more like a set of old, unfamiliar walls she was just trying to get used to. She was a quiet kid by nature, a little jumpy, and her folks had sunk everything they had into this place just a couple of weeks back. It was a big, unsettling change. Her friend Savannah was a different story. She was all high-strung energy, always poking around, looking for something to get into. That evening, the special kind of boredom that only happens at a sleepover had taken hold. It was late, 11:33 p.m. to be exact. They had scrolled through every video on their phones, and the minutes were dragging by. So Savannah started talking about the basement. "I bet it's spooky down there," Savannah said, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "Come on, Addie. Let's go see." Addison shook her head, pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "No way! It's probably just a bunch of boxes and spiders." "Exactly," Savannah shot back, her eyes wide with excitement. "And probably some spiders the size of your fist. We need a good story to tell at school. The night we faced the basement monster." She let out a sharp laugh, but Addison didn't find it funny at all. Still, Savannah was like a dog with a bone. Once she got an idea in her head, there was no stopping her. A sleepover with Savannah meant you were going to do whatever crazy thing she wanted to do. Soon enough, against her better judgment, Addison was standing at the top of the basement stairs. The door let out a long, drawn-out creak as they pulled it open, a sound that made Addison's skin crawl. Savannah grabbed an old flashlight from a drawer in the kitchen and clicked it on. It sputtered for a second, the light flickering weakly. Then a dim, yellowy beam appeared. They went down the old wooden steps. Each one made a sharp cracking noise under their weight, like a gunshot in the otherwise silent house. It was chilly down there. The air was still and thick, completely different from the rest of the house. It smelled of packed dirt and something else, something stale and old, like clothes left in a damp suitcase for too long. Addison could hear her heart going like a drum against her ribs, a frantic, thumping rhythm. The weak flashlight beam bounced off of cardboard boxes, old floor lamps, and furniture draped with white sheets, making everything look like a gathering of ghosts. Savannah was leading the way, her voice echoing in the enclosed space as she kept up a nervous chatter. "See? Nothing to worry about, just a bunch of junk." Then she stopped dead. Her beam landed on a part of the wall, a section of old dark wood paneling. At first glance, it looked like the rest of the wall, but it was just a little bit off. One of the rectangular panels was a shade darker than the ones around it, and the lines where it met the others weren't quite straight. It was a patch job, but a clumsy one. "That's weird," Savannah whispered, her voice suddenly losing its confident edge. "Why would they patch the wall like that?" Addison felt a new wave of fear wash over her. This wasn't the fun kind of fear you get from a scary movie. This was a deeper, uglier thing, the kind of fear you get when you realize something is fundamentally wrong with your own home. "Let's just go back upstairs, Savannah. Please." Wait, Savannah said, her eyes wide with curiosity. She reached out and pressed her palm against the wood. It didn't give. So she put her shoulder to it, leaned in, and gave it a good, solid shove. A low groan of grinding wood came from behind the wall, a sickening, scraping sound. Then the entire section moved, swinging inward just a few inches into blackness. A wave of air, colder and damper than the rest of the basement, rushed out at them. It smelled of wet earth, body odor, and something faintly sour like spoiled food. They stood there, frozen. The flashlight beam poked through the opening and into a small black room behind the wall. Savannah, moving as if in a trance, took a step forward, pushing the paneling wide open. The beam swept across the tiny space. It was a dirt-floored room, a crawl space of some kind, maybe a little bigger than a standard closet. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with things. There was a grimy, stained sleeping bag rolled up in one corner. Empty food cans, beans mostly, sat on the ground. A pile of men's clothes was heaped in another corner. Someone was living here. Addison felt all the blood rush out of her face. A tight, suffocating feeling took hold of her chest. This was real. This was happening. Savannah's hand shot up to her mouth, cutting off a gasp. Her flashlight beam landed on a low wooden crate in the middle of the room. On it were a pair of old, scuffed-up binoculars. There was also a small video camera mounted on a tiny tripod, its lens pointing toward the panel door. And next to that was the stack of photos. Savannah, pale and completely silent, reached into the small room and snatched the stack. The two of them stared at the pictures, their hands trembling. The first picture was of Addison's mom in the kitchen, making dinner just last night. The second was of Addison in the backyard, throwing a ball to their dog 2 days ago. The photos were grainy and out of focus, but there was no mistaking them. They were taken from a strange low angle, like the camera was pushed up against the wall. It was then that Addison saw them, a handful of tiny, carefully drilled holes in the paneling, all looking out into their living room and kitchen. Their living room, their kitchen. They had been watching. Every meal, every conversation. A sudden, high-pitched ringing sound came from the video camera. A small red light on its side began to flash, an evil little eye blinking in the dark. The camera was on. The person who lived here had a remote. And they were coming back. Savannah let out a small, quiet sob, a sound of pure terror. She grabbed Addison's arm, her grip like a vice. The two girls took off, running. The sound of their shoes slapped against the concrete floor and then hammered on the wooden steps as they scrambled upwards. They ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and slammed the heavy basement door shut behind them. They didn't say a word. They bypassed Addison's room and ran straight down the hall, bursting into her parents' bedroom, yelling and crying, shaking them awake. Addison's dad jolted from a deep sleep, his face a mask of confusion and concern, listened to their frantic story. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his nightstand and walked down into the basement himself. He came back up a moment later, his face grim and pale. He called the police, When the officers got there, they went straight for the room. They looked at the pictures and the equipment, and they went outside, scanning the perimeter of the house. The previous owner, they learned, was a quiet man named Walter who lived alone. They figured he had somehow gotten a key to the house made before he sold it. They looked for him, but they couldn't find him. It seemed he had just disappeared into thin air. An officer told them the man had been coming and going for weeks, probably even months before they moved in, living in that tiny hidden space, watching the family. They were told the man was likely gone for good, that he knew they had found his nest and wouldn't be coming back. He was never found. The family sold the house. Addison eventually moved away, but she could never shake the icy dread that had settled in the foundation of her memory. And the truly scary part? Her story isn't that unique anymore. Far from it. You hear about people finding cameras all the time now. It happens to nearly half of them. Think about that. Nearly half. And the really sick part is where they find them. 1 in 5 times. It's in the bedroom. The bathroom. Addison found a man living inside her walls, but the truth is, the walls don't need to be broken anymore. Every smart device, every little black dot on a smoke detector, every forgotten phone charger plugged into the wall, they're all just holes for someone to look through. In a state like Texas, it's a felony to do that. But that chilling fact doesn't change a thing when you're the one being watched. You are never truly alone, and the eyes on you could belong to anyone, anywhere. Bedroom doors were shut all over the small 2-story house, but on Friday night, the basement was loud. Down there, 6 girls were spread out across a makeshift kingdom of couches and blankets. It was the first night of Gigi's 16th birthday weekend sleepover. Gigi, Isabella, Madison, Ava, Emily, and Chloe were in their own little world. It was warm, smelled like a mix of buttery popcorn and cheap hairspray, and it felt like the safest place on earth. They had talked for hours, laughing until their sides hurt. Now, as the phone screen showed it was well past 1 in the morning, the energy was finally starting to fade. The wild laughter had been replaced by sleepy murmurs. The basement grew peaceful. Suddenly, a loud metallic clank echoed from somewhere high up in the house, followed by a low roar. Emily, who always seemed to be wound a little tighter than everyone else, sat bolt upright. "What was that?" she whispered. Gigi didn't even open her eyes. "Relax, Emily," she said with a sleepy smile. "It's just the furnace." It's ancient. She'd heard that sound her whole life. It was just one of the house's familiar groans. The other girls relaxed, and a soft, genuine quiet settled over the room. They lay like that for a few minutes in perfect sleepy peace. And into that quiet, a new sound was born. It wasn't a clank. It wasn't the furnace. It was a heavy, uneven thumping. "Gigi," Emily whispered, her voice sharp with a new kind of fear. "That doesn't sound like a machine." They all went silent, listening, and they all knew she was right. This was different. This was a sound none of them, not even Gigi, had ever heard before. Through a quiet, terrified process of elimination, they realized the sound was coming from the attic. They spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the awful, distant movement until it finally stopped with the dawn. The next day, Saturday, the bright daylight and the smell of pancakes made the memory seem silly. The house was quiet all day, no strange noises. When Gigi's dad came down, Gigi mentioned the sounds, and he just smiled. "This old house is full of noises," he said. "Don't worry about it." Gigi was happy to accept that. For her, the fear was over. But not for Emily. She couldn't shake the feeling of that heavy, rhythmic sound. That night, they gathered in the basement again. The other girls, following Gigi's lead, tried to pretend everything was normal, but Emily couldn't let it go. Around midnight, while the others were talking, she stood up. "Where are you going?" Gigi asked. "I'm going to get a drink," Emily said, her voice a little too firm. "And I'm going to prove to myself that it was nothing." Gigi just shrugged and turned back to her conversation. Emily crept up the basement stairs and into the quiet house. The only light was a small nightlight in the main hallway. Her heart pounded as she walked toward the kitchen. To get there, she had to pass the hallway closet where the pull-down cord for the attic stairs was. She glanced up. Usually, the heavy attic door was shut tight, secured by a heavy-duty lock. But tonight, it was different. The lock was undone. The heavy door was hanging open just a crack, a sliver of perfect, consuming blackness in the ceiling. Emily froze. A cold dread washed over her. This was wrong. Before she could scream, the door flew open. A man burst out of the darkness, dropping from the attic with a heavy thud. He was older, rail-thin, and wore dusty, oversized clothes. He launched himself at Emily. He tackled her to the floor, pinning her down. He wasn't saying words, just making panicked, choked crying sounds as he pressed his weight on her. Emily screamed, a raw, terrified sound that tore through the quiet house. Downstairs, the talking stopped. They heard the scream and the crash. Gigi's face went white. "Emily," she breathed. They scrambled up the stairs and saw the horrific scene. 4 of them ran, screaming, to get Gigi's dad. Within seconds, her dad was there. He pulled the man off Emily, wrestling him away as she scrambled back, gasping for air. The man offered little resistance once he was off her, collapsing into a frightened, sobbing heap on the floor. But there were no calls to the police. Gigi's grandmother didn't run for the phone. She just stood there, her hand over her mouth, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Gigi's dad's face was white. He looked from the sobbing man on the floor to the 5 terrified girls huddled at the top of the stairs. His expression wasn't one of a rescuer. It was one of a man whose entire world was about to collapse. "Get your things," he said, his voice a low, threatening whisper. "Get them now. The sleepover is over." He herded the sobbing man back toward the attic stairs, while the girls, crying and shaking, ran to the basement to grab their bags. When they came back up, he was waiting for them at the front door. "Listen to me," he said, his eyes scanning each of their faces. "You will not say a word about this to anyone. Not your parents, not your friends, nobody. There was a family emergency, that's all. Do you understand me?" It wasn't a request, it was an order, underlined with a threat they could all feel in the air. One by one, he drove them home in a dead, suffocating silence. At each house, he walked the girls to their doors, telling their sleepy, confused parents that there had been a family emergency and that Gigi was just too upset to continue the party. When he got back home with only Gigi left, the house was silent again. Her grandmother had taken the man back into the attic. The pull-down door was shut, the lock firmly in place, as if nothing had ever happened. Gigi's dad sat her down at the kitchen table. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a heavy, soul-crushing exhaustion. And then, he told her everything. The man's name was Caleb. He was family. He was the son of Gigi's grandfather, who had passed away years ago. But his mother was not Gigi's grandmother. His mother was her grandfather's own sister. Caleb was a secret, born of incest, a product of a deep, crippling family shame from a different time. No one ever spoke of it. Instead of getting him help, the family had hidden him away. For years and years, he had lived in the attic, a ghost in their home, fed and cared for in secret. The violation was absolute. The threat wasn't a monster or an intruder. It was the family she trusted, and the father who now made her a part of the secret. The house was no longer a home. It was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion built on a foundation of betrayal, where the man who watched you sleep was a secret kept by the very people you loved. It left a scar that would never fully heal, a constant, nagging question. How many places in your own life do you call safe, when all along, the only thing keeping you from the darkness is a paper-thin layer of trust? Four girls were gathered for a sleepover in a sprawling Florida house, the kind with too many empty rooms and hallways that seemed to stretch on forever in the dark. On paper, it was a normal teenage ritual, a night planned for junk food and whispered gossip. But this night was different. It had a purpose, a dark point on the schedule hammered out by the group's unspoken leader, Willa. Willa was a live wire, always looking for a boundary to push. She was pacing the cavernous living room, the beam of her phone's flashlight jerking across the furniture, making shadows leap and dance. Watching her was Samantha, the observer. Sam didn't say much, but she missed nothing. She saw the nervous energy radiating from Willa, and she saw how it was affecting the other two. Astrid, the determined skeptic, was trying her best to look unimpressed, flipping through a magazine on the floor as if this were just any other boring Friday night. But her eyes kept flicking up from the page, drawn to Willa's restless movement. And then there was Juniper, the believer. She was already coiled tight on the sofa, a thick blanket pulled up to her chin, her knuckles white where she gripped the fabric. She was the one who knew, on some deep level, that some doors are best left unopened. Tonight's plan wasn't about movies or makeovers. It was about summoning a ghost. It was about Bloody Mary. The house itself seemed complicit. It was a new construction, but it had the unnerving silence of a place much older. It was so quiet you could hear the faint, electrical whine of the refrigerator from 2 rooms away. The air conditioning would kick on with a sudden whoosh that made you jump, then settle into a low rumble that was somehow more unsettling than the silence it replaced. Every floorboard seemed to hold its breath, waiting to creak under the slightest pressure. It was a house that felt empty, but watched. The perfect stage for what was to come. Willa finally stopped her manic pacing. "It has to be the guest room bathroom," she announced, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still managed to fill the large room. "It's got that huge mirror." Astrid let out a dismissive snort. "The size of the mirror doesn't matter, Willa. It's a dumb party game for children." Her voice was laced with scorn, but there was a tremor in it she couldn't quite hide. "That's what people always say in the stories, right before it's too late," Willa countered, her eyes gleaming in the phone light. A thin, challenging smile touched her lips. "So, are we doing this or what?" Juniper gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea that went ignored. Willa was already turning, heading for the grand staircase that led to the 2nd floor. One by one, the others followed her, pulled along by that potent teenage cocktail of fear and irresistible curiosity. They were walking willingly into the dark. Upstairs, they filed into the guest bedroom. It was a big room, dominated by a massive, dark wood bed frame that looked like something out of a historical movie. But they weren't interested in the bed. Their target was the attached bathroom. Willa pushed the door open. It was a large bathroom, the kind with 2 sinks set into a long marble countertop. And stretching above it, from wall to wall, was a single enormous sheet of mirror. Willa flicked the light switch off, plunging the room into near-total blackness. The only illumination was a weak gray smear of light filtering in from the hallway through the door they'd left slightly ajar. It was just enough to see the massive mirror. A dark, featureless rectangle that looked less like glass and more like a sheet of still black water. It didn't reflect so much as it absorbed. Willa positioned herself directly in front of it, a dark silhouette against the void. Samantha and Juniper pressed themselves against the cold tile of the back wall, trying to make themselves small. Even Astrid leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed, her eyes locked on the mirror with an anxious intensity she could no longer conceal. The rules of the ritual were ancient and simple. Say the name 3 times into the dark. Bloody Mary. Willa's voice was strong, defiant, echoing slightly in the tiled room. Bloody Mary. Samantha's was barely a whisper, a frightened breath. Bloody Mary. Willa said it for the final time, drawing the words out, savoring the tension. A heavy, unnatural silence fell. Every background noise they had grown accustomed to seemed to have been instantly switched off. It was the silence of a soundproof room. All 4 girls were staring at their own indistinct reflections, their breath held, waiting. Nothing happened. The screen on Willa's phone, lying face up on the counter, turned over to 1:11 a.m. A wave of relief washed over them. Astrid was the first to break the silence, letting out a short, nervous laugh. See? Nothing. I told you it was... She stopped mid-sentence. A confused look crossed her face. She brought a hand up to her nose. When she pulled it away, her fingers were slick with dark blood. What the... Juniper gasped. Willa took a step toward Astrid. Are you okay? My head, Astrid mumbled, swaying slightly. It feels like it's splitting open. Just as the words left her mouth, Juniper let out a small, terrified whimper. A single bright red drop of blood fell from her own nose and hit the white tile floor with a sound that was shockingly loud in the quiet room. Then it was a trickle. Panic began to set in. Willa turned from Astrid to Juniper, her face a mask of disbelief. As she opened her mouth to say something, her own head snapped back, a sharp, choked sound escaping her throat. Her nose was bleeding now, too. A hot spike of pain shot through her skull. Samantha watched in horror as her friends, one by one, were struck down by an unseen force. She felt a wave of dizziness, a crushing pressure building behind her own eyes. And then the warmth, the slick, wet feeling under her nose. It was happening to her, too. Lost in a haze of pain and confusion, their vision began to blur and darken at the edges. Finally losing control, Juniper let out a single piercing, terrified shriek that ripped through the house and brought Willa's mother running from downstairs. When their vision finally snapped back into focus, it wasn't to the blurry, familiar reflections they expected. Standing directly behind them, reflected with impossible clarity in the center of the dark glass, was a 5th figure. She was tall and gaunt, her body shrouded in heavy, dark Victorian mourning clothes that seemed to drink the light. Her face was hollow, her skin the color of old wax, and her empty black eyes seemed to look directly through each of them, a gaze of ancient malice. The girls, united in a singular primal terror, didn't hesitate. They didn't scream again. The sight was too horrifying for sound. They simply bolted. They shoved past each other, scrambling on the cold tile floor, a mad tangle of limbs leaving a trail of small red droplets and smeared blood on the bathroom door and the hallway carpet. Willa's mother found them there, a heap of hysterical, blood-streaked girls, and the house instantly filled with the chaotic sound of worried shouts, running footsteps, and the eventual, mournful wail of an ambulance siren cutting through the night. At the hospital, the confusion was total. The medical staff ran every test they could think of. The nosebleeds were real, But the extensive physical exams, the blood tests, and the psychological evaluations all came back clean. The doctors could find no physical cause for the bleeding or the headaches. Their symptoms were real, but their origin was entirely non-physical, a fact that baffled the professionals and petrified the girls. The next few days passed in a haze of fear. The girls were physically safe, but the memory was a haunting echo. Life attempted to return to normal, but the world felt different. Then, 3 days after the incident, Samantha was at her house. Her mother was home with her. The silence in her own house was now a source of dread, heavy and expectant. Suddenly, from the closed master bathroom upstairs came a single, sharp, unmistakable sound. Crack! It was the sound of something shattering under immense internal pressure. Samantha froze on the stairs, her heart pounding. Slowly, forcing one foot in front of the other, she went up. As she reached the top of the stairs, her mother came out of the bathroom, holding a hair straightener. "Oh, honey, you won't believe what I just did," her mom said with a sigh of frustration. "I was rushing and I dropped this thing, and it hit the mirror just right. It's completely cracked." She didn't seem panicked or scared, just annoyed at her own clumsiness. Samantha cautiously stepped past her and pushed open the bathroom door. Her mother was right. The large polished mirror was cracked. A spider web of fractures spread out from a single point of impact near the edge of the glass. Just a normal, messy, random break. Nothing else was there. No shape, no silhouette, no face. Her mother saw her staring. "I know, what a mess. I'll have to call someone to replace it tomorrow." She shook her head and walked away, leaving Samantha alone in the doorway. She was staring at a simple, broken mirror, and a cold dread, deeper than anything she felt that night, washed over her. It was just a coincidence, a perfectly timed, perfectly normal accident. There was no receipt. There was no proof. There was only the memory, now trapped inside her own head with no way out, and the chilling question that would follow her for the rest of her life. What was real? A face, pale and flat, was pressed hard against the basement window. It wasn't just looking in. It was staring, its eyes wide open and locked on the spot where a 12-year-old girl had been standing just a second ago. Outside, the night was pitch black, the kind of dark you only find in the suburbs where the streetlights are few and far between. Because of that darkness, the face didn't look like it was attached to a body. It was just there, floating, a disembodied mask in a sea of black. Violet, the girl who saw it, didn't make a sound. Her breath just seized up in her chest. She stood frozen, staring right back at it. This whole thing went down in a quiet Colorado town, late in 2020. It's the type of place people move to for a reason. They want to feel safe. You see kids' bikes left out on the grass overnight, and nobody bats an eye. Folks leave their cars unlocked in the driveway. There's a feeling baked into the neighborhood that nothing truly bad could ever really happen here. So, inside a house on one of these quiet streets, two 12-year-old girls were having a sleepover in the finished basement. Lila, whose house it was, and her best friend, Violet. It was a Friday night, no school tomorrow. They'd torn the couch apart to build a fort of pillows and blankets. A cheesy horror movie was playing on the big TV, one of those with cheap effects that make you laugh more than they scare you. Bowls of half-eaten popcorn and candy wrappers littered the floor around them. It was a perfect, normal night. That basement was their own little world. It was fully decked out with a small kitchen, its own bathroom, and a massive sectional couch that took up most of the room. It was the best hangout spot a kid could ask for. But it had one strange feature. In one of the walls, There was this window. It wasn't normal. It was a single wide pane of glass, set real low, only a couple of feet up from the carpet. It was basically at ground level. If you sat on the floor, you could look right up into the side yard and see the stars. It was always locked, and it seemed more like some weird design idea from the 70s than a functional window. It felt secure. You'd have to be crawling around in the dirt to even look through it, so nobody ever gave it a second thought. Midnight rolled by. The bad horror movie ended, and the girls did what kids do. They pulled out their phones and disappeared into the glow of the small screens, wrapped up in their blanket fort. The only light in the room came from their devices. Upstairs, the house was dark and completely quiet. Lila's parents were fast asleep. The whole street, the whole town, was asleep. Around 1:30 in the morning, the first thing happened. It wasn't a sound, it was a flicker of movement. From her spot on the couch, Lila glanced up from her phone for a second, her eyes adjusting to the dark. For just a fraction of a second, she thought she saw a shadow pass by the low window. It was quick, like a cat running past or a plastic bag blowing across the lawn. She blinked, stared at the window for a solid 10 seconds, and saw nothing. Just the blackness of the yard. She told herself she was seeing things, that her eyes were tired from staring at the screen. She went back to her phone. A few minutes of silence went by. Then came the sounds. The first was a soft but clear tap, right on the glass of the low window. Both girls froze. It sounded exactly like a fingernail clicking on the pane. That tap was followed by a long, quiet scratching sound, like a branch with no leaves being dragged along the concrete wall. They looked at each other, and Lila whispered, "Raccoon." Violet nodded, relieved to have an explanation. They held on to that idea because the alternative was too scary to think about. But the relief didn't last. The next sound they heard was different, and it was much closer. The basement had its own door to the outside, a heavy, solid door that led to a short flight of concrete steps up to the side yard. From that door, they heard a soft, metallic rattle. It wasn't a violent shake, but a quiet, careful turning of the doorknob, first one way, then the other, testing it. The girls went completely still, straining to listen. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a new sound started. A low, splintering creak, as if someone was putting their shoulder against the door, testing its strength, seeing if the frame would give. Lila looked at Violet in the dim light from their phones, her eyes wide with terror. That wasn't a raccoon. That was someone. And they weren't just circling the house anymore. They were at their door, trying to get into the basement with them. Inside, that cozy, safe feeling was gone. The shadow, the sounds, they were no longer a mystery. They were a clear and present threat. The girls were trapped, and they knew someone was standing just on the other side of that door, patiently trying to get to them. That's when Violet got up. She had to see. She had to know what was happening outside. She moved towards the kitchenette, which gave her a view of the low window. The room was almost completely dark now, except for the shifting colors of the TV's screensaver bouncing off the walls. As she walked, her path took her right past that window, and that's when she saw it, the face. He was lying on his stomach in the grass, his face pushed up against the glass, his hands cupped around his eyes like binoculars to see into the dark room. His expression was blank, his eyes wide open, staring with a horrible, focused intensity. In the dim light, Violet could just make out the pale shape of his features, the dark mass of his hair, and the awful shine of his eyes as they scanned the room for any sign of movement. She started backing away from the window. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet on a string. She couldn't look away. Her eyes were locked with his. From the couch, Lila saw the look on her friend's face. It was pure animal fear, the kind you see in movies but never in real life. Lila's eyes followed her friend's terrified gaze down to the window. And then she saw him too. The face hadn't moved an inch, still there, watching. Some shared, unspoken instinct kicked in. They didn't scream. They didn't run for the stairs. They just knew, somehow, that the only thing to do was to disappear. They dropped to the floor and scrambled behind the huge sectional sofa that sat in the middle of the room. It was a heavy, solid piece of furniture, and once they were behind it, crouched low on the carpet, they were completely out of sight from the window. For a second, they were hidden, but he was still out there. This was the predator they had heard moments before at their door, and now he knew they were here. The two girls huddled together in the dark. Their entire world became that small, cramped space behind the couch. The only sound was the frantic pounding of their own blood in their ears. Outside, the silence was total. And that silence was the most terrifying sound they had ever heard. He wasn't banging on the glass. He wasn't yelling or trying to break in. He was just out there, waiting, being patient. Lila's hands were shaking so bad she could barely work her phone. She knew she had to call for help, but the thought of making any noise, even talking, was paralyzing. What if he heard her voice right through the glass? She swiped the screen on and slid the volume all the way down. Her finger trembled as she punched in the 3 numbers, 911. A woman's voice answered, calm and professional. 911, what is your emergency? Even with the volume on the lowest setting, that voice sounded like a gunshot in the dead quiet room. Lila jammed the phone against her ear, squeezed her eyes shut, and breathed out a dry, choked whisper. Someone is outside. Beside her, Violet was shaking, her hand clamped tight over her mouth to keep from making any sound. The next 20 minutes felt like a lifetime. Time just stretched and twisted. Every single second felt like an hour. The man didn't move. They knew it. They could feel him out there, his face still pressed to the glass, his eyes still staring at the empty space where they had been standing. He was a statue made of pure menace. Lila had to whisper her address to the 911 operator, one agonizing, breathless word at a time. The operator was good. She kept her voice low and calm, but every time Lila had to speak, a fresh wave of terror hit her, the certainty that her tiny whispers would carry through the wall and give them away. The silence outside was a heavy weight. They couldn't hear him breathing, couldn't hear a footstep on the grass, just that awful, perfect stillness. The pressure of his stare felt like a physical thing, pushing through the wall. Finally, after an eternity of silent terror, a new sound came into the world. It was far away at first, a faint wail on the night air, but it was getting louder, a high-pitched, steady cry cutting through the night. Police sirens. The moment that sound sliced through the silence, something outside the window moved. The girls heard a clear, scraping sound as the man finally lifted his head away from the glass. They held their breath, listening with an intensity they didn't know they had. Then they heard it. The sound of boots on the grass and gravel, walking away from the house. He wasn't running. The steps were calm, deliberate, unhurried. He was just walking off into the dark like his work had been interrupted. A minute later, the whole basement lit up with flashing red and blue lights from the patrol car in the driveway. They heard Lila's parents yelling their names, running down the stairs, followed by the heavy, solid sound of police boots. Lila and Violet were pulled out from behind the couch, shaking and crying, but they were safe. The police found the man just a couple 100 yards from the house, still walking, not running, just calmly walking down the street as if he were out for a midnight stroll. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The real horror, the part that sticks with you, came when the police told them what he had in his backpack. It was the proof of what his patient, unblinking stare had been promising all along. The man was a registered offender. He wasn't there for a laptop or a TV. His bag had two things in it. Two things that removed any doubt about what was supposed to happen that night. Inside, the police found a brand new, unopened roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a thick bundle of plastic zip ties.